Some loves vanish like smoke. But on that night, what was thought lost forever rose again. Drenched in rain, veiled in white, kneeling at a gate no one expected. The boy's scream shattered the night. "That's my mama!" Gasps rippled through the crowd, boots scraped against the wooden boards, and a hush fell so heavy you could hear the rain striking dust into mud. What happens when a love thought buried forces its way back through the storm? And what price must be paid when truth returns, dressed as memory? Stay, and you will see the night this town could never forget, the night when silence broke, and no heart here was ever the same again. Tell me, if you were there, would you believe her? Share where you're watching from, and may this tale stay with you long after today. The morning in Dry Willow Hollow began with the slow crack of wood splitting under an axe. The sound echoed against the canyon walls, rolling through the valley like a tired hymn. The air carried the smell of pine resin and damp earth, heavy from the storm that had swept through the night. Clouds lingered low, bruised and swollen, as though the sky itself was reluctant to let the sun through. Across the meadow, the town's church bell gave one dull strike, announcing the hour with no particular urgency. Chickens scratched at the wet ground, and smoke curled lazily from a few chimneys, blending into the gray sky. James Whitaker stood at the edge of his yard, muscles taut beneath his faded work shirt, the axe handle worn smooth from years of labor. At 36, his face carried the rough etchings of a man who had survived more winters than he cared to count. The once boyish jaw had hardened, the soft brown of his eyes was shadowed by years of suspicion and solitude. His dark hair, streaked with early gray, fell untamed against his forehead. He worked like a man who believed if he stopped moving, the memories would catch him, and he feared those memories more than the cold. Inside the small cabin behind him, the sound of laughter sometimes drifted out, a boy's laughter. Ethan, 9 years old, small for his age but wiry, with sandy hair and a pair of blue eyes bright as morning water. He was James's son, though the boy carried questions in his eyes that James never dared answer. The child had his mother's gaze, that piercing light that saw through walls James had built. It was both a blessing and a curse, because every time he looked at Ethan, he saw the face of the woman who had left. The axe bit deep into the next log when a sound rose over the meadow. Not laughter this time, a cry, thin, sharp, and unmistakable. "That's my mama!" James froze, his grip tightening on the wood, his heart slammed against his ribs. Slowly, he turned toward the train station that sat not far down the dirt road. Steam hissed against the morning damp, white clouds breaking against the platform roof. Townsfolk gathered in clusters, their chatter a low hum under the screech of brakes. And there, clear as the cut of a knife, was his boy Ethan standing on the fence rail, pointing with a trembling finger. "That's my mama!" the boy cried again, louder, his voice cracking. James's breath stopped. His eyes followed the boy's pointing hand, and then he saw her. A woman stepped down from the train, her dress once white but now dulled with age and weather. The gown's hem frayed, its lace stained by time, but its shape unmistakable. It was a wedding dress. Her auburn hair fell loose, wet from the mist, framing a pale face carved by both beauty and grief. Catherine. For a moment, James thought he had conjured her out of his own torment. She had haunted his dreams for 4 years, always turning away, always unreachable. Yet here she was, alive, her eyes darting across the crowd until they found Ethan. And when they did, her knees buckled. She sank to the ground at the edge of the station fence, her trembling hands clutching the rail as though it were the last solid thing in her world. James staggered back, the axe slipping from his hand into the mud. The clang rang out like a gunshot. His chest heaved, confusion and rage wrestling in his veins. He remembered her promise, whispered on the night she vanished. "I'll come back for you, I swear it." But the dawn had come, and she had been gone. He had raised Ethan alone, his heart calcified with bitterness. But the boy, his boy, had seen something James never wanted him to see. Ethan had recognized her. Not because James had spoken of her. He hadn't. He had buried her name deep where even God might forget it. The twist cut deeper than any blade. Ethan had seen her face in the sketch James once drew, the one he had hidden away in a wooden chest under his bed. James had drawn it in the first year of her absence, when hope was still alive. The boy must have found it. He must have stared at it in secret, piecing together the mystery of the woman who lingered in silence between father and son. James's throat burned. He wanted to shout, to deny, to rip that memory from the air. Instead, he shouted only one thing. "Ethan!" Inside, his voice cracked with fear, but Ethan didn't move. The boy's small fingers clenched the fence rail, his knuckles white. His lips trembled with something too big for his young chest to hold. He whispered again, softer this time, almost to himself, "Mama." James strode forward, boots slapping against the wet earth. His hands shook, not from cold, but from something he could not name. Anger, longing, terror. He reached for his son, but his eyes, damned, traitorous eyes, lifted to the woman kneeling at the gate. Catherine's gaze locked on him at last. Rain had begun to fall again, thin threads weaving between them. Her lips parted as though she might speak his name, but no sound came. Instead, she pressed her forehead to the wet wood of the fence, shoulders shaking. Her hands clutched the bars not as a beggar, but as a penitent at the altar. And James, standing in the mud, his son's hand slipping from his grasp, felt the world collapse into that single moment. James's shout tore through the rain. "Ethan, inside! Now!" The boy flinched, startled by the raw edge of fear in his father's voice. Yet James's command faltered. His hand, strong as iron when wielding an axe, now trembled. For outside the gate, Catherine knelt in the dirt, her wedding dress soaking, her eyes fixed on him with a desperation that threatened to split open the walls he had built. His breath caught. His heart pounded like war drums, and his hand, still lifted, shook as if it no longer belonged to him. Rain pressed harder against the cabin roof, each drop hitting like a drumbeat of unease. The world outside had grown darker, though it was still morning. The storm thickened, swallowing light, painting everything in shades of slate and charcoal. The air smelled of wet earth and iron, the way it does when the sky is about to tear itself open. James stood by the door, one hand braced against the frame. He had ordered Ethan inside, and the boy had obeyed, though reluctantly. The echo of Catherine's knees hitting the muddy ground by the gate still rattled in James's skull. Her image through the rain, the soaked gown, the way her forehead pressed against the wood seared itself onto him like a brand. But instead of stepping toward her, instead of offering even a shred of shelter, he retreated. His boots scuffed the floorboards as he backed away. The cabin's dim interior swallowed him up, shadows licking across his face as though the house itself conspired to hide his weakness. His mind betrayed him. Memory bled in, unbidden. A different night, years ago, lantern light flashing across a wagon wheel, Catherine's hand slipping from his, the rough voice of her father stern, commanding, dragging her into the carriage. "It's done. Forget him." And her eyes, wide and shimmering with a promise. "I'll come back for you. I swear it." The wheels had rolled into the dark, and dawn had broken with her nowhere in sight. The thunder outside now sounded like those wheels, grinding away hope. James swallowed hard, chest burning with an ache he thought he had locked away forever. Behind him, a whisper. "Mama." He spun. Ethan was at the window, his small shoulders hunched, his breath fogging the glass. He had pushed the curtain aside just enough to press his face near the frame. James's stomach twisted. He strode forward, meaning to yank the boy back, but then he froze. He saw it, Ethan's lips moving, not only in awe, but in secret. The boy was whispering through the gap, his voice barely audible under the storm. "Don't cry, Mama. I hear you. I see you." James's heart lurched as if struck. His own son, the one he had shielded, the one he had raised in silence about Catherine, was reaching out across the divide, reaching to the very ghost James had tried to bury. "Ethan." James's voice broke. He grabbed the boy's shoulder, pulling him away from the glass. The boy flinched but did not look ashamed. His eyes, so blue they hurt to look at, met James's with a stubborn brightness. "You lied," Ethan whispered. "You said she was gone forever." The words sliced clean. James staggered back as though his son had thrown a blade instead of a sentence. He wanted to shout, to crush the boy's defiance, but what rose instead was a deeper pain, the realization that his silence had only birthed more longing, more secrets. Outside, the storm thickened. Rain coursed down the window like tears, blurring the figure still kneeling at the gate. Catherine had not moved. The sight of her, blurred but unyielding, throbbed in James's chest. He wanted to pull Ethan close, to tell him he had done it all for him, for protection, for survival. But when he reached out, his son shrank back, his small frame trembling. And in that moment, James felt betrayed twice over. Once by Catherine, years ago, and now by his own child, who seemed to choose her despite not knowing her. His throat closed. Rage and grief collided. He slammed his palm against the window frame, the crack echoing through the cabin. Ethan startled, tears springing to his eyes, but James did not soften. He couldn't. He strode to the door, opened it just long enough for the rain to spray in, and then, without a word, he slammed it shut again. The sound rang like a verdict. Catherine remained outside. James's chest heaved. He dragged himself toward the curtain, pulled it just enough to look out. Rain streaked across the glass. Catherine still knelt, hands gripping the gate, her lips moving in silent prayer or plea. He couldn't hear the words, but he felt them. And his own heart, hardened by years, rebelled against him. What if she speaks truth? What if she never chose to leave? He shut his eyes, pressing his forehead against the cold wood of the window frame, torn open in a way he had not been in years. The storm roared louder, a cruel chorus to the chaos inside his chest. James's fists clenched, his breath shallow as he whispered into the dark, not for Ethan, not for Catherine, but for himself. If she's telling the truth, then what have I done? What have I? The storm had not lifted by evening. Instead, it crouched low over the hollow like a predator waiting to strike. Rain slid down the windows in jagged sheets. The wind clawed at the shutters, prying and rattling as though it wanted in. The air inside the cabin was heavy, thick with wood smoke that refused to rise cleanly through the chimney. The dim flame of a lantern on the table bent with every draft, throwing restless shadows along the walls. James sat alone at the edge of the table, his hands roughened from work pressed flat against the grain. His ears still rang with Ethan's whispers. His chest still burned with the image of Catherine kneeling in the mud. He closed his eyes, but no darkness could hide her face. Then came the knock. 3 deliberate raps against the door. Slow. Waited. James rose, muscles tight as bowstrings. He half expected Catherine again, or worse, someone sent to drag her away. Instead, when the door swung open, the night wind carried in the hunched form of Henry Lawson, the old post rider. Henry was past 70, his spine bent, his beard ragged and yellowed. His coat hung off him in damp folds, and his eyes, pale and watery, looked like glass marbles dulled with age. Once known for his steady hand and loyal roots, Henry now survived more on habit than strength. "Evening, James," the old man wheezed, his voice frayed like rope. In his hand he held something small, wrapped in oilcloth, the edges stiff with age. His fingers shook as he held it out. This was meant for you." James frowned. He pulled the oilcloth back. Inside was a letter. Its paper was yellowed, edges stiffened by time. A dark stain marred one corner rusty brown, like dried blood. The storm hushed in James's ears. His breath shortened. Slowly, he slid a finger under the flap, tearing it open. The paper crackled as though it had been waiting years to speak. Catherine's handwriting. Slanted, hurried, ink blurred in places as though written with trembling hands. He read the first line aloud, voice barely more than a rasp. "James, they are taking me against my will. Please find me. Don't let him decide our fate. I swear I will fight for us." James's knees buckled. He sank into the chair, letter shaking between his fingers. The lantern's flame blurred as tears welled. For 4 years he had carved hatred into his heart stone by stone, building a fortress of anger to protect himself from hope. And now this. His chest heaved, his vision blurred. The man he had become roared inside him. Too late. Too late. Too late. His fists clenched, crushing the fragile paper as if by destroying it he could silence the truth. His cry tore from him, raw and guttural. "Damn it! Why now?" The lantern shuddered on its hook. Ethan startled awake in the loft above, his small voice calling, "Papa?" James swallowed the sound, forcing his voice steady. "Back to bed, son." Henry lingered near the door, hat clutched in both hands. His gaze flickered away, shame clouding his features. "I should have brought it sooner," he whispered. James's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean, sooner?" Henry's hands twisted the brim of his hat. His lips quivered before words came. "I had it 4 years ago, the day it came. But your wife's father, he made sure it never reached you. He paid me." The words dropped like stones in the room. James surged to his feet, fists trembling, his face twisted with disbelief. "You—" He couldn't finish. His breath came in sharp bursts, like a man drowning. Henry raised a hand, his own eyes glistening. "He threatened me, James. Said if I delivered it, he'd see me ruined. I had no kin to protect me, just a frail old man trying to last another winter. I took his money, and I buried the letter." Silence pressed hard. Only the storm spoke, rattling the shutters. James staggered back, his hand dragging across the table, knocking the lantern sideways. The flame flared before settling, light sliding across his broken expression. For years he had cursed Catherine in his heart. For years he had sharpened his pain into anger, raised his son with half a truth. And now he realized the foundation of his fury was nothing but lies. He turned back to the letter. His rough thumb traced over the smear of blood, imagining her hand torn, bleeding as she wrote it. She had called to him, she had begged him, and he had never come. The fortress inside him cracked. Anger leaked through, mingling with shame, with grief, with something dangerously close to hope. Henry's voice trembled from the door. "I can't undo it, James. I can't give you back them years. But I thought you should know the truth before I die with it on my soul." James said nothing. His chest heaved, his fists unclenched slowly. He looked older in that moment than his 36 years, worn down not by time, but by the wasted weight of anger carried too long. Henry slipped out into the storm, leaving the door ajar. Wind and rain swept in, chilling the cabin. James didn't move to shut it. He couldn't. He sat, alone. The letter crushed in his grip. He stared at the words until they blurred into nothing but ink and blood. His breath hitched. His body bent over the table as if the weight of the years had finally broken him. His whisper bled into the storm. "Did you fight for us, Catherine? Did I condemn us both for nothing?" The lantern guttered. The rain fell harder. James sat alone in the half-dark, the letter ruined in his fist, his voice trembling into silence. His final thought rang louder than the storm itself. Did she fight for us after all? The night carried a fever. It seeped through the cabin walls, a heat that did not belong to the fire in the hearth. James awoke to Ethan's cry, a sound that split the silence like a knife. The boy's small body writhed on the bed, sweat soaking the thin blanket, his cheeks flushed with a sickly crimson. His breath came in ragged gasps, shallow, uneven, punctured by moans that tightened James's chest with terror. He stumbled to his son's side, his calloused hands hovering uselessly above him. The boy's skin burned under his palm, his eyes rolled back, unfocused, lips whispering words James couldn't catch. For the first time in years, James felt helpless. His strength, so reliable when splitting logs or facing storms, meant nothing now. His arms, built to shield, to strike, to endure, hung powerless as his son's fever climbed. "Ethan," his voice cracked. He tried dampening a cloth in the basin, pressing it to the boy's brow, but the heat devoured it within seconds. Panic clawed up his throat. His heart thundered with a primal fear he had never known, even in the cruelest nights of loneliness. Then the door groaned open. A figure stepped through the shadows. Rain clung to her dress, her hair matted against her cheeks. Catherine. She moved without hesitation, as though no storm, no hatred, no memory could stop her. She fell to her knees beside Ethan, her hands trembling as they cupped his face. "My baby," she whispered, her voice breaking, the words carrying a tenderness that pierced James deeper than any blade. James froze. The sight stole the breath from his lungs. Catherine's eyes, filled with anguish yet luminous with maternal certainty, locked on the boy with such fierce love that James's chest caved. For years he had convinced himself she had abandoned them. But here, this was not the face of betrayal. This was the face of a mother who had been torn away and had returned to claim her child. Ethan stirred at her touch, his cracked lips parting to form one word, "Mama." The sound gutted James. His instincts rebelled against his bitterness. His body moved before thought caught up. He reached for the coat hanging by the door, the heavy wool he used on nights like this when the wind cut to the bone. Without speaking, he draped it over Catherine's shoulders. Their eyes met, his hard, hers shimmering. For an instant, something ancient stirred between them, something older than anger. "We need Pastor Miller," James muttered, voice hoarse. Catherine nodded once, her hand never leaving Ethan's brow. Together, without hesitation, they lifted the boy. James cradled him against his chest, Catherine steadying his limbs. The fevered heat radiated from Ethan like a furnace, making every breath James took feel like fire. They stepped into the storm. Rain assaulted them, stinging their skin, soaking them through. The wind roared, dragging at their clothes, trying to wrench Ethan from James's arms. Lightning tore the sky wide open, illuminating Catherine's pale face beside him, her hair plastered to her temples. She clutched James's arm, not in weakness, but in resolve. The road to Pastor Miller's parsonage twisted down the valley, mud sucking at their boots, water rushing in rivulets like veins of the earth laid bare. Each step was a battle. James gritted his teeth, his arms tightening around Ethan, terrified that the boy's shivers might stop, that silence might replace his fevered moans. But amid the chaos, something impossible took root in James's chest. He looked down, saw Ethan in his arms, Catherine at his side. He was carrying them both, holding together what he had believed was lost. A realization thundered through him, louder than the storm. I am not alone. The thought staggered him. For 4 years, solitude had been his armor. Now, in the crucible of the storm, he felt the weight of 2 lives pressed against him, fragile, yet undeniable. Pastor Miller's house came into view at last, its lantern glowing like a beacon through the rain. They pounded on the door, and within moments, it swung open. Pastor Miller, a man of 50 with a broad frame softened by years of simple living, appeared. His hair, once black, was now streaked with gray, his spectacles slipping down the bridge of his nose. His face carried a calm that rarely cracked, but tonight, worry shadowed his eyes as he saw the boy. Inside, quickly. His voice was low but firm. They laid Ethan on the narrow bed by the fire. Catherine clung to his hand, murmuring prayers, her lips brushing his damp skin. James stood frozen, dripping rain onto the wooden floor, unable to look away from the scene. The pastor pressed cool cloths to Ethan's body, his movements practiced, steady. Fever like this can take a child if we do not fight it fast, he said. But he's strong. Strong like both of you, James's throat closed. He wanted to believe it. He wanted to believe strength was enough. The hours crawled. Rain battered the roof. Catherine whispered lullabies between sobs. James sat rigid, his hands gripping his knees until his knuckles whitened. Every gasp from Ethan twisted deeper into his marrow. At last, as dawn bled pale light into the room, Ethan's breathing eased. His skin cooled under Catherine's touch. Relief struck James so sharply that his shoulders sagged, his face dropping into his hands. When he looked up, Catherine was bent over Ethan, her lips brushing the boy's temple, whispering words James couldn't hear. Her eyes glistened with both exhaustion and hope. James's chest clenched, his pulse hammered. The storm outside had broken, but a fiercer storm raged within him. He stared at her, torn apart by the question that refused to let him rest. Had he been wrong all along? Or would trusting her once more only destroy him again? James stood over Ethan's bed, Catherine's whisper threading through the quiet dawn. His hand trembled at his side, his heart splitting between longing and fear. His voice, raw and unsteady, cracked inside him. Have I been wrong, or will she betray me again? The harvest festival breathed life into the valley like nothing else. Lanterns swung from beams and wagon wheels, their glow painting the square in shades of amber and gold. The scent of roasted corn and spiced cider lingered in the air. Music from a fiddle scraped bright and sharp, weaving with the sound of boots tapping in time on the wooden platform. Children darted between hay bales, their laughter quicksilver. James stood at the edge of it all, a man caught between belonging and exile. He wore his best shirt clean, though the cuffs were frayed and his boots had been polished until they almost reflected the lantern light. In his pocket, against his chest, nestled the silver ring that had once belonged to his mother. Its edges were worn smooth by decades of use, yet to him it was the strongest symbol of promise he could carry. Tonight he meant to give it to Catherine. Tonight, under the lights and before the people who had whispered too long about his broken life, he intended to claim her not as a memory, not as a ghost, but as his wife. He searched the crowd. Catherine stood near the cider stall, her hair braided back, her dress plain but mended with care. The lantern glow touched her face gently, softening the weariness in her eyes. Ethan clung to her hand, grinning as he pointed at the fiddler. James's throat tightened. He wanted to walk over, to kneel and show her the ring, but his boots would not move. His heart pounded against his ribs like fists against a locked door. And then, the sound of hooves, sharp, cutting, growing louder until it silenced the music. The fiddler faltered. Laughter thinned. The crowd turned. A black stallion burst into the square, foam flecking its chest, hooves striking sparks from the stones. Atop it sat Silas Crow. He was younger than James by a handful of years, but ambition and cruelty carved lines deeper into his face than age could. His black coat flared with every movement, and his hat brim shadowed eyes that glittered like steel. He carried himself with the arrogance of a man who believed law bent to his will. He pulled the horse to a halt before the square's center, and from his saddlebag he drew out a folded paper. His voice carried, sharp as a lash. "By rights and record, Catherine Hale is mine. Here is the contract signed, sealed. She is bound to me." A murmur surged through the crowd, like a storm tide threatening to break. Catherine went white. Ethan clutched her skirt, his eyes wide with fear. James's blood roared in his ears. Every eye turned toward him, waiting, weighing. He saw in their faces the question he dreaded. Would he stand silent again, as he had years ago when Catherine was taken, or would he rise? His fists clenched. He stepped forward. "No paper makes a woman yours," he growled, his voice thick with fire. Silas's smile was a cruel slash. "Then prove it, Whitaker." "Here. Now." The crowd pulled back, creating a ring of space. Dust swirled in the lantern light. For an instant, silence reigned, the silence before a storm. James lunged. The fight was raw, brutal. Fists cracked against jaws, boots slid in dust, grunts and gasps punctuated the night. Silas struck hard, his knuckles splitting James's lip, blood running down his chin. James staggered, his vision flashing white, but rage and love steadied his legs. He swung back, catching Silas's jaw, sending him sprawling into a barrel of cider. The crowd gasped, torn between shock and thrill. "Stop this madness!" a voice cried. It was Henry Lawson, the old post rider, his frail frame shaking as he pushed through the ring. His face was pale, yet his voice carried. "That contract is a lie. Bought and forged by Catherine's father, used to chain her where she did not belong." Beside him, Pastor Miller raised his hand, spectacles glinting in the lantern light. "I was there when she was taken. I saw the coercion, the cruelty. This marriage is not of God nor of law, it is a cage." The crowd rippled. Whispers grew louder, anger brewing. Silas's face darkened with fury. He lunged again, striking James across the mouth. James dropped to his knees, spitting blood onto the dust. The lantern light swam. His chest heaved. Around him, the crowd roared, some for Silas, some for him. Catherine cried out, her voice desperate. "James!" He pressed his palms into the dirt, forcing his body upright, though every muscle screamed. His heart thundered in chaos, torn between the hope he saw in Catherine's eyes and the dread that whispered she might break him again. Blood dripped from his lip, staining the ground. He lifted his head, his gaze locking on Catherine, her hands trembling, her face etched with terror and faith in equal measure. His knees buckled. He fell forward, the ring still clenched in his fist. The crowd hushed as James knelt in the dust, blood running down his chin, heart thrashing in his chest. His thoughts screamed louder than the shouts around him. "If she betrays me again, will I survive it?" The square had not yet stilled from the chaos. Dust lingered in the air, rising and falling in golden plumes beneath the lanterns. James knelt in that dust, blood streaking his lip, the silver ring clenched in his trembling hand. The crowd pressed in, their whispers like the restless murmur of a river threatening to flood. Catherine stood a few paces away, her hands clasped to her chest, her face pale but luminous, as though the lantern light itself leaned toward her. James drew in a ragged breath. Then slowly, painfully, he forced himself to rise. His knees quaked, his body screamed, but something stronger than pain carried him upright. He turned, found Catherine's eyes, and with a voice torn yet resolute, he spoke so all could hear, "No man, no paper, no lie will ever break us again." The words cracked open the silence. A hush swept over the crowd, heavy and trembling, before bursting into scattered gasps. James crossed the space between them. Dust clung to his boots. His breath steamed in the cooling air, and when he reached her, he dropped to one knee, not in defeat this time, but in vow. He opened his palm, the ring gleamed, catching the firelight. "Catherine," he said, voice breaking on her name, "be my wife." Not by law twisted or by paper forged, but by love that endured even when I thought it gone. Catherine's tears spilled freely. She lowered to him, her hands covering his, her body folding toward his broken but unyielding frame. "Yes," she whispered, and the square erupted. Cheers, cries, claps of relief and wonder. Ethan's small voice pierced above them all. "Kiss her." The crowd laughed, the tension cracking like ice under spring thaw. Even James' blood on his mouth, dust on his shirt, laughed through the tears that streaked his face. He pulled Catherine close and pressed his lips to hers, sealing not just a vow, but a resurrection. The following morning, the town gathered beyond the edge of the fields. The storm had passed. The sky was a vast sweep of blue, the air sweet with the smell of turned earth and ripening grain. A wide oak tree stood tall at the meadow's center, its branches sprawling like arms ready to embrace. Beneath it, the pastor waited, his hand steady on his worn Bible. Catherine wore a simple gown, mended in places but glowing in the sunlight as if spun from light itself. James wore no finery, only his clean shirt and boots, but he carried himself taller, freer, the shadows stripped from his face. Ethan stood between them, holding both their hands, grinning so wide his cheeks hurt. Pastor Miller's voice rang clear. "This union is not of coercion nor of paper, but of truth freely spoken. James Whitaker, Catherine Hale, today, before God and this town, you vow anew." James slid the silver ring onto her finger. His hand shook, not with doubt, but with awe. Catherine's lips trembled as she whispered her vow, promising not return, but presence, promising now. When the pastor declared them husband and wife, the crowd erupted in cheers. Bells clanged from the church, and the meadow filled with applause. Yet for James, the world narrowed to the light in Catherine's eyes. It was not shadowed, not clouded, not begging to be believed. It shone with the certainty of a woman who had fought and returned. As dusk fell, lanterns were hung from branches, casting the meadow in warm pools of gold. The music of fiddles rose once more, this time carrying joy without tension. Children ran, skirts and boots kicking dust into ribbons of light. Women clapped, men stamped their feet, the sound rolling across the field like thunder softened by laughter. James stood at the edge of it all, Catherine's hand resting in his. Ethan darted forward, caught up in the dance, his laughter like bells. For the first time in years, James allowed himself to breathe deep and long, filling his lungs with the scent of hay and hearth smoke, feeling not the weight of loss, but the weight of belonging. He glanced at Catherine, saw her watching Ethan, and in her gaze he recognized something unbreakable. Not perfection, not promise of no pain, but truth, a truth hard-won. Later, when the crowd had thinned and the music softened, James sat with Catherine and Ethan beneath the oak tree. The lanterns flickered overhead. Fireflies drifted through the grass, their glow like tiny sparks of memory and renewal. James drew his son into his lap. Catherine leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. His eyes wandered across the meadow, the laughter fading, the lanterns swaying, the night folding in gently. 4 years I wasted in hatred, he whispered, more to himself than to them. But tonight, I know, I was saved not by strength, but by love I thought was gone. Catherine's hand found his. Ethan, half asleep, murmured, "We're home, Papa." And James believed him. The oak tree loomed above them, its branches spread wide, its roots deep. A witness to storms and seasons, it still stood scarred, weathered, but alive. Under its shelter, James realized, so were they. Sometimes the deepest wounds are not carved by time or distance, but by silence, by lies that take root where trust once lived. James's journey reminds us that even after years of bitterness, the heart can still learn to forgive, to see truth where once it saw only shadows. Love, when it endures the storm, becomes stronger than any paper or chain, because it binds us not by law but by choice again and again. And perhaps that is the truest gift, that no matter how far we stray, we can still find our way back to each other. And now I'd love to hear from you. Did this story touch your heart the way it touched mine? Share with us in the comments where you're watching from, and if you'd like more tales of love, courage, and second chances, be sure to subscribe. May this story stay with you, and may the light of forgiveness walk beside you tonight.